Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Wilds. Tonight's story is Pride and Prejudice, the beloved classic by Jane Austen, told slowly and gently to help you drift off to sleep. I still haven't set up any kind of membership just yet, though it may happen down the road, so for now, if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, the best way to support the channel is simply liking the video and subscribing, and letting me know in the comments which story you'd like to hear next. Now, get yourself comfortable, settle into bed, and take a nice, slow breath with me. Let's begin. It is a truth universally acknowledged, that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families, that he is considered the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do not you want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. "Why, my dear, you must know, Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately, that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week. What is his name? Bingley. Is he married or single? Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls. How so? How can it affect them? My dear Mr. Bennet, replied his wife, how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them. Is that his design in settling here? Design? Nonsense! How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes. I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, for as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley may like you the best of the party. My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of. But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighborhood. It is more than I engage for, I assure you. But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go, merely on that account, for in general, you know, they visit no newcomers. Indeed you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice, that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. Mr. Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley, though he had always intended to visit him, and had continually assured his wife that he should not go. Till the evening after the visit was paid, she had no knowledge of it at all. It was then disclosed in the following manner. Observing his second daughter employed in trimming a hat, he suddenly addressed her with, "I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie." "We are not in a way to know what Mr. Bingley likes," said her mother resentfully, "since we are not to visit." "But you forget, Mamma," said Elizabeth, "that we shall meet him at the assemblies, and that Mrs. Long promised to introduce him." "I do not believe Mrs. Long will do any such thing. She has 2 nieces of her own. She is a selfish, hypocritical woman, and I have no opinion of her." "No more have I," said Mr. Bennet, "and I am glad to find that you do not depend on her serving you." Mrs. Darling, all astonishment, could scarcely believe her own good fortune when Mr. Bennet finally revealed the truth of his earlier visit. Mrs. Bennet deigned not to make any reply, but, unable to contain herself, began scolding one of her daughters. "Don't keep coughing so, Kitty, for heaven's sake. Have a little compassion on my nerves. You tear them to pieces." "Kitty has no discretion in her coughs," said her father. "She times them ill." "I do not cough for my own amusement," replied Kitty fretfully. "When is your next ball to be, Lizzie?" "Tomorrow fortnight." "Aye, so it is," cried her mother, "and Mrs. Long does not come back till the day before, so it will be impossible for her to introduce him, for she will not know him herself." "Then, my dear, you may have the advantage of your friend, and introduce Mr. Bingley to her." "Impossible, Mr. Bennet, impossible, when I am not acquainted with him myself." "How can you be so teasing?" "I honor your circumspection. A fortnight's acquaintance is certainly very little. One cannot know what a man really is by the end of a fortnight. But if we do not venture, somebody else will, and after all, Mrs. Long and her nieces must stand their chance, and, as she will think it an act of kindness, if you decline the office, I will take it on myself." The girls stared at their father. Mrs. Bennet said only, "Nonsense, nonsense." "What can be the meaning of that emphatic exclamation?" cried he. "Do you consider the forms of introduction, and the stress that is laid on them, as nonsense?" "I cannot quite agree with you there. What say you, Mary? For you are a young lady of deep reflection, I know, and read great books, and make extracts." Mary wished to say something sensible, but knew not how. "Let us pause here for a moment," and simply rest in the quiet warmth of this particular household. Picture the comfortable, slightly cluttered sitting room at Longbourn, evening candlelight flickering softly, 5 daughters scattered about with their various occupations, sewing, reading, or simply listening with varying degrees of interest to their parents' familiar banter. Outside, the English countryside settles quietly into evening, hedgerows darkening beneath a gently fading sky. There is something deeply comfortable in this scene, a family whose daily rhythms have long since settled into familiar, well-worn patterns, Mrs. Bennet's nerves, Mr. Bennet's dry wit, and 5 very different young women, each finding her own quiet place within the gentle chaos of home. News of a wealthy new neighbor has stirred just enough excitement to enliven an otherwise ordinary evening, without yet disturbing the fundamental, comfortable calm of Longbourn itself. We will continue shortly, following what happens as the Bennet family, and indeed the whole neighborhood, finally has the opportunity to properly meet this Mr. Bingley everyone has been discussing so eagerly. While Mary was preparing her response, the conversation drifted elsewhere, and it was not many days before Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit, and sat with him about 10 minutes in his library. He had entertained hopes of being admitted to a sight of the young ladies, of whose beauty he had heard much, but he saw only the father. The ladies were somewhat more fortunate, for they had the advantage of ascertaining from an upper window that he wore a blue coat and rode a black horse. An invitation to dinner was soon afterward dispatched, and already had Mrs. Bennet planned the courses that were to do credit to her housekeeping, when an answer arrived which deferred it all. Mr. Bingley was obliged to be in town the following day, and, consequently, unable to accept the honor of their invitation. Mrs. Bennet was quite disconcerted. She could not imagine what business he could have in town so soon after his arrival in Hertfordshire, and began to fear that he might be always flying about from one place to another, and never settled at Netherfield as he ought to be. Lady Lucas quieted her fears a little by starting the idea of his being gone to London only to get a large party for the ball, and a report soon followed that Mr. Bingley was to bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him to the assembly. The girls grieved over such a number of ladies, but were comforted the day before the ball by hearing that, instead of 12, he had brought only 6 with him from London, his 5 sisters and a cousin. When the party entered the assembly room, it consisted of only 5 altogether, Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the husband of the eldest, and 1 more young man. Mr. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanlike, he had a pleasant countenance, and easy, unaffected manners. His sisters were fine women, with an air of decided fashion. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year. The gentleman pronounced him to be a fine figure of a man, and the ladies declared he was much handsomer than Mr. Bingley, and he was looked at with great admiration for about half the evening, till his manners gave a disgust which turned the tide of his popularity. For he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, and above being pleased, and not all his large estate in Derbyshire could then save him from having a most forbidding, disagreeable countenance, and being unworthy to be compared with his friend. Mr. Bingley had soon made himself acquainted with all the principal people in the room. He was lively and unreserved, danced every dance, was angry that the ball closed so early, and talked of giving one himself at Netherfield. Such amiable qualities must speak for themselves. What a contrast between him and his friend! Mr. Darcy danced only once with Mrs. Hurst and once with Miss Bingley, declined being introduced to any other lady, and spent the rest of the evening walking about the room, occasionally speaking to one of his own party. His character was decided. He was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped that he would never come there again. Amongst the most violent against him was Mrs. Bennet, whose dislike of his general behavior was sharpened into particular resentment by his having slighted one of her daughters. Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged, by the scarcity of gentlemen, to sit down for 2 dances, and during part of that time, Mr. Darcy had been standing near enough for her to hear a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley, who came from the dance for a few minutes to press his friend to join him. "Come, Darcy," said Bingley, "I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing about by yourself in this stupid manner. You had much better dance." "I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it, unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. At such an assembly as this, it would be insupportable. Your sisters are engaged, and there is not another woman in the room whom it would not be a punishment to me to stand up with. I would not be so fastidious as you are," cried Bingley, "for a kingdom. Upon my honor, I never met with so many pleasant girls in my life as I have this evening, and there are several of them, you see, uncommonly pretty. You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room," said Mr. Darcy, looking at the eldest Miss Bennet. "Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I ever beheld. But there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you, who is very pretty, and I dare say very agreeable." "Which do you mean?" And turning round, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till catching her eye, he withdrew his own and coldly said, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me, and I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me." Mr. Bingley followed his advice. Mr. Darcy walked off, and Elizabeth remained with no very cordial feelings toward him. She told the story, however, with great spirit among her friends, for she had a lively, playful disposition, which delighted in anything ridiculous. The evening altogether passed off pleasantly to the whole family. Mrs. Bennet had seen her eldest daughter much admired by the Netherfield party. Mr. Bingley had danced with her twice, and she had been distinguished by his sisters. Jane was as much gratified by this as her mother could be, though in a quieter way. Elizabeth felt Jane's pleasure. Mary had heard herself mentioned to Miss Bingley as the most accomplished girl in the neighborhood, and Catherine and Lydia had been fortunate enough never to be without partners. They returned, therefore, in good spirits to Longbourn, the village where they lived, and of which they were the principal inhabitants. They found Mr. Bennet still up, with a book in his hand, perfectly indifferent to what had made the evening so eventful to at least 4/5 of his family. He had rather hoped that his wife's views on the stranger would be disappointed, but he soon found that he had a different story to hear. "Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet," she cried as she entered, "we have had a most delightful evening, a most excellent ball. I wish you had been there. Jane was so admired, nothing could be like it. Everybody said how well she looked, and Mr. Bingley thought her quite beautiful, and danced with her twice. Only think of that, my dear, he actually danced with her twice, and she was the only creature in the room that he asked a second time." Mrs. Bennet continued, with great animation, to relate every detail of the evening, and though her husband listened with visible reluctance, she pressed on undeterred, describing Bingley's admiration for Jane in such glowing terms that even Mr. Bennet's dry composure could not entirely suppress a small, quiet satisfaction at his favorite daughter's happiness, mixed with his usual wry amusement at his wife's boundless enthusiasm for the whole affair. Elizabeth, listening quietly from her own corner of the room, could not help but reflect, with some private amusement of her own, on the curious contrast between the evening's two most notable gentlemen, one so warmly and universally admired, the other so coldly and universally disliked, and wonder, with a small, private smile, whether Mr. Darcy's poor opinion of the local company might yet prove entirely mutual before their acquaintance, however brief, came properly to its end. Within a short walk of Longbourn lived a family with whom the Bennets were particularly intimate. Sir William Lucas had been formerly in trade in Meryton, where he had made a tolerable fortune, and risen to the honor of knighthood by an address to the king during his mayoralty. The distinction had perhaps been felt too strongly, for it had given him a disgust to his business and to his residence in a small market town, and, quitting them both, he had removed with his family to a house about a mile from Meryton, denominated from that period Lucas Lodge, where he could think with pleasure of his own importance, and, unshackled by business, occupy himself solely in being civil to all the world. Lady Lucas was a very good kind of woman, not too clever to be a valuable neighbor to Mrs. Bennet, and they had several children, the eldest of whom, a sensible, intelligent young woman of about 27, was the intimate friend of Elizabeth. The morning after the assembly, the ladies of Longbourn and Lucas Lodge met to talk it all over, and Charlotte Lucas listened with great patience to Elizabeth's playful account of Mr. Darcy's rudeness, while Mrs. Bennet continued to expand upon her firm conviction that Jane's marriage to Mr. Bingley was already, in essence, a settled matter, requiring only the passage of time before it became publicly known to everyone in the neighborhood. That Mr. Bingley should return the visit paid him by Mr. Bennet, and be prevailed on to join the party at Longbourn to dinner, was a matter of considerable satisfaction to Mrs. Bennet, and in due course, the invitation was accepted, and the Netherfield party arrived in good time. When they repaired to the dining room, Elizabeth eagerly watched to see whether Bingley would take the place, which, in all their former parties, had belonged to him, by her sister, and her wise mother, having the same idea, forbore to invite him to sit by herself or Lydia. Jane's color was heightened by the exercise, and became her friend Charlotte's sister remarked afterward that she looked remarkably well, though Elizabeth privately thought that her sister was allowing her heart to be far too easily and quickly won by a gentleman whose good qualities were plain enough, but whose deeper character remained, as yet, largely untested. Miss Bingley's civility to Elizabeth increased at last with some rapidity, though it was accompanied with a coolness of manner that quite convinced Elizabeth of the insincerity behind it. As for Mr. Bingley himself, his attentions to Jane became more marked with every visit, and even Elizabeth, ever inclined toward gentle skepticism, began to allow that his admiration seemed genuine enough to warrant her mother's high hopes, though she still worried about her sister's tendency to conceal her own feelings quite so thoroughly, even from those who loved her most. Occupied in observing Mr. Bingley's attentions to her sister, Elizabeth was far from suspecting that she herself was becoming an object of some interest in the eyes of his friend. Mr. Darcy had at first scarcely allowed her to be pretty. He had looked at her without admiration at the ball, and when they next met, he looked at her only to criticize. But no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she had hardly a good feature in her face, than he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. To this discovery succeeded some others, equally mortifying. Though he had detected with a critical eye more than one failure of perfect symmetry in her form, he was forced to acknowledge her figure to be light and pleasing, and in spite of his asserting that her manners were not those of the fashionable world, he was caught by their easy playfulness. Of this she was perfectly unaware. To her, he was only the man who made himself agreeable nowhere, and who had not thought her handsome enough to dance with. He began to wish to know more of her, and, as a step toward conversing with her himself, attended to her conversation with others, a maneuver which drew her notice, and she began asking herself, with some private amusement, precisely what he could mean by it, and whether his sudden attentiveness represented anything more than the same disagreeable pride she had already so firmly settled him with. The occasion arose properly at Sir William Lucas's, where a large party had assembled. Sir William, ever the diplomat, had introduced Mr. Darcy to the subject of Elizabeth's dancing, hoping to encourage a partnership between them, and Darcy, rather to Elizabeth's surprise, requested the honor of her hand, which she quite decidedly declined, much to Sir William's evident disappointment and Darcy's own puzzlement at her firm refusal. Miss Bingley, observing this exchange with narrowed, watchful eyes, soon approached Darcy with pointed remarks about the tediousness of such gatherings, evidently hoping to draw his attention away from Elizabeth entirely, and speculating aloud, with poorly disguised jealousy, about what precisely might have captured his interest so thoroughly this particular evening. "I can guess the subject of your reverie," said she. "You are considering how insupportable it would be to pass many evenings in this manner, in such society, and indeed I am quite of your opinion. I was never more annoyed. The insipidity, and yet the noise, the nothingness, and yet the self-importance of all these people. Your conjecture is totally wrong, I assure you, Darcy replied. My mind was more agreeably engaged. I have been meditating on the very great pleasure which a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman can bestow. Miss Bingley immediately fixed her eyes on his face, demanding to know which lady had the credit of inspiring such reflections, and Darcy, with more resolution than gallantry, replied at last, Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Let us pause here for a moment, and rest quietly in the warmth of this particular evening. Picture Sir William Lucas's drawing room, candles glowing softly against the darkening windows, the murmur of polite conversation drifting comfortably from group to group, cards being dealt at one table, dancing continuing gently at the other end of the room. There is a particular, gentle irony settling quietly over the whole scene, that the proudest man in the room has just, however reluctantly, admitted something rather tender about a woman who believes him entirely indifferent to her. Miss Bingley, though clearly displeased by this admission, continues the conversation with feigned interest, already turning the whole matter over in her mind for how she might discourage such an unwelcome attachment before it has any real chance to grow. Elizabeth herself, quite unaware of any of this, continues chatting easily elsewhere in the room, entirely confident in her low opinion of Mr. Darcy, an opinion that shows no immediate sign of softening. We will continue shortly, following what happens as circumstances soon draw Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy into rather closer, and considerably more prolonged, acquaintance than either of them had originally anticipated. Not long after this evening, an invitation from Netherfield arrived for Jane, and Mrs. Bennet, seeing an excellent opportunity to further encourage the match with Mr. Bingley, insisted that Jane travel there on horseback rather than in the carriage, correctly predicting that rain would likely fall and oblige her daughter to stay the night. Her scheme succeeded rather too well, for Jane was caught thoroughly in a downpour, and arrived at Netherfield soaked through, developing shortly afterward a genuine and troubling cold that kept her confined to her bed there for several days. Elizabeth, deeply concerned for her sister's welfare and unwilling to simply wait anxiously at home for news, resolved to walk the 3 miles to Netherfield herself, crossing field after field with quick step, jumping over stiles and springing over puddles with impatient activity, and arriving at last with her petticoat 6 inches deep in mud, her face glowing warmly from the exercise. Miss Bingley and her sister were astonished at such an exhibition, considering it close to indecent that Elizabeth should have walked so far, alone, in such dirty weather, though Mr. Darcy, watching quietly from across the room, found himself thinking rather more admiringly than critically about the healthy glow such vigorous exercise had brought to her complexion, a private opinion he kept carefully, and somewhat uncomfortably, to himself. Elizabeth remained at Netherfield to nurse her sister, and during this extended visit, she and Mr. Darcy found themselves thrown together with considerably greater frequency than either had previously experienced, dining together each evening, and often occupying the same drawing-room during the long hours after dinner. Miss Bingley, ever alert to any sign of Darcy's growing partiality, took every opportunity to draw unflattering comparisons between Elizabeth's country manners and the more polished sophistication expected in fashionable society, hoping thereby to diminish whatever admiration he might be developing. Darcy himself remained largely silent during these evenings, occupied chiefly with a book, or so it appeared, though Elizabeth noticed, with some private curiosity, how frequently his attention seemed to drift from his reading toward whatever conversation she happened to be engaged in at the time. When directly questioned by Miss Bingley about his opinion of Elizabeth, he offered only careful, measured responses, unwilling to reveal quite how much his feelings toward her had already shifted since their first, rather unpromising encounter at the Assembly Ball. Elizabeth herself remained entirely unaware of any of this quiet, growing interest, continuing to regard him as proud, disagreeable, and largely indifferent to her, an impression that suited her perfectly well, since it allowed her to enjoy their occasional verbal sparring matches without any concern about deeper feelings complicating what she considered a purely intellectual, and rather entertaining, rivalry. One evening, as the party gathered in the drawing room after dinner, conversation turned toward the subject of accomplished women, and what precisely such a term ought properly to encompass. Miss Bingley listed an impressive array of qualities: music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages, along with a certain something in her air and manner of walking, before Darcy added, somewhat more demandingly, that a truly accomplished woman must also possess a genuine improvement of her mind through extensive reading. "I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women," Elizabeth remarked dryly. "I rather wonder now at your knowing any. Are you so severe upon your own sex as to doubt the possibility of all this? I never saw such a woman. I never saw such capacity, and taste, and application, and elegance, as you describe, united." Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley both cried out against the injustice of her implied doubt, both protesting that they knew many women who answered this description perfectly, until Mr. Hurst called them to order, complaining bitterly of their inattention to what was going forward at the card table, and putting an end to all conversation for the moment as everyone settled back into their respective games and quiet occupations for the remainder of the evening. Let us rest here once more, picturing the warm, candlelit drawing room at Netherfield settling into its evening stillness. Cards shuffle softly at one table, the fire crackles gently in its grate, and Elizabeth, having successfully defended her sex against Mr. Darcy's rather demanding standards, allows herself a small, private smile of satisfaction at having, however briefly, gotten the better of him in conversation once again. Darcy watches her across the room with an expression that, had she noticed it properly, might have surprised her considerably, not the cold disapproval she has come to expect from him, but something softer, more thoughtful, the quiet admiration of a man beginning to realize, with some private discomfort, that his feelings toward this particular young lady have grown into something rather more serious than he ever intended or anticipated. We will continue shortly, following Jane's recovery, and the Bennet sisters' eventual return to Longbourn, where new developments, and new acquaintances, await them both. Bringing together everything explored across this section of our story, a clear and gentle picture has begun taking shape. Jane's growing attachment to Mr. Bingley continues developing warmly and steadily, encouraged by both families, though tempered by her own natural reserve in openly displaying her feelings. Elizabeth, meanwhile, remains happily oblivious to the quiet, growing admiration developing within Mr. Darcy, continuing to regard him as proud and disagreeable, entirely unaware that her own wit and independence of mind have begun working a rather unexpected transformation in his opinion of her. Miss Bingley's jealous maneuvering has, thus far, done little to discourage whatever feelings Darcy has begun developing, and the extended stay at Netherfield has only deepened the acquaintance between Elizabeth and Darcy, drawing them into precisely the kind of prolonged, close contact that seems destined, sooner or later, to bring whatever lies beneath their sharp, playful exchanges properly and openly to the surface. There remains still more of this gentle story left to explore, new characters yet to arrive in the neighborhood, misunderstandings yet to unfold, and the slow, careful working out of feelings that neither Elizabeth nor Mr. Darcy has yet fully acknowledged, even to themselves. Not long after Jane and Elizabeth returned safely to Longbourn, a letter arrived that threw the household into considerable excitement, from a certain Mr. Collins, a cousin of Mr. Bennet's who, owing to the peculiar workings of the entail on the family estate, stood to inherit Longbourn itself upon Mr. Bennet's death, since the property could not, under the terms of that entail, pass to any of the 5 Bennet daughters. Mr. Collins wrote to announce his intention of visiting, expressing, in rather elaborate and self-important language, his eagerness to make peace between the 2 branches of the family and to offer what comfort he could to the Bennet ladies regarding their eventual circumstances. Mr. Bennet, reading the letter aloud with barely concealed amusement at its pompous phrasing, remarked that Mr. Collins appeared to be exactly the mixture of servility and self-importance the letter's style suggested, and the family awaited his arrival with a mixture of curiosity and, on Mrs. Bennet's part, cautious hope that his visit might somehow soften the harsh reality of the entail that would one day deprive her and her daughters of their home. When Mr. Collins finally arrived, he proved to be a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25, whose air was grave and stately, and whose manners were very formal, spending a great deal of his conversation praising, at almost tiresome length, the many excellent qualities of his patroness, the formidable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, whose condescension and notice he clearly regarded as among the greatest honors of his entire existence. Mr. Collins had not been long at Longbourn before he settled, with characteristic decisiveness, upon a plan of marrying one of the Bennet daughters himself, considering this the most proper and gentlemanly way to atone, in some small measure, for the injury his eventual inheritance would otherwise cause the family. His attention first settled upon Jane, as the eldest and most beautiful, but Mrs. Bennet, alarmed at the thought of losing her most promising prospect for Mr. Bingley, hastily informed him that Jane was likely soon to be engaged elsewhere, and gently steered his attentions instead toward Elizabeth. Elizabeth, quite unaware of this maneuvering at first, found herself increasingly the object of Mr. Collins's rather formal and awkward attentions over the following days, his conversation filled with elaborate compliments delivered with all the grace of a man reciting from a manual rather than speaking from genuine feeling. She began to suspect, with a certain private dismay, exactly what direction his interest was taking, and resolved, quietly but firmly, that whatever proposal might eventually come her way, her answer would be a decided refusal. Mrs. Bennet, delighted by what she perceived as an excellent match developing before her very eyes, encouraged the growing acquaintance at every opportunity, entirely confident that Elizabeth would recognize the practical wisdom of securing her own future through marriage to the very man who would otherwise displace her family from their home. The proposal, when it finally came, occurred one morning when Mrs. Bennet contrived to leave Elizabeth alone with Mr. Collins under the thinnest of pretexts, sending the other girls from the room on various invented errands. Mr. Collins began his address with characteristic formality, listing, in careful order, his reasons for marrying, his conviction that it would add to his happiness, his belief that it was proper for every clergyman to set an example of matrimony in his parish, and, not least, the express recommendation of the very noble lady whom he had the honor of calling his patroness. He proceeded, with equal formality, to enumerate Elizabeth's own particular attractions, her wit and vivacity, though qualified immediately with the assurance that he would expect these qualities to be considerably moderated once she took her proper place as a clergyman's wife. Elizabeth, struggling to maintain her composure throughout this rather mechanical recitation, attempted several times to interrupt with a clear and decided refusal, but Mr. Collins, entirely convinced that a young lady's initial refusal was merely customary modesty rather than genuine rejection, simply continued undeterred, assuring her that he fully expected her to renew the subject again shortly, once she had properly considered the excellent advantages of his proposal. Mrs. Bennet's reaction to this refusal, when it reached her ears, was every bit as dramatic as might be expected. She hurried immediately to find Mr. Bennet, insisting that he compel Elizabeth to reconsider and accept the proposal, certain that her daughter had taken leave of her senses to refuse such a secure and practical match. Mr. Bennet, however, upon hearing the full circumstances, took considerably more amusement than alarm from the whole affair. "Come here, child," he said to Elizabeth, when she was summoned before him. "I have sent for you on an affair of importance. I understand that Mr. Collins has made you an offer of marriage. Is it true?" Elizabeth replied that it was. "Very well, and this offer of marriage you have refused?" "I have, sir." "Very well. We now come to the point. Your mother insists upon your accepting it. Is it not so, Mrs. Bennet?" "Yes, or I will never see her again. An unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth. From this day you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do." Elizabeth could not but smile at such a conclusion, delivered with her father's characteristic dry wit, and though Mrs. Bennet continued to fret and complain bitterly about her daughter's obstinacy for several days afterward, Mr. Collins, his pride somewhat wounded, soon transferred his attentions elsewhere, finding a far more receptive audience in Elizabeth's close friend, Charlotte Lucas. Let us pause here for a moment, and rest quietly in the gentle stillness of Longbourn's garden. Picture Elizabeth walking alone along a familiar path, the autumn air cool and crisp around her, sunlight filtering softly through thinning leaves overhead. She feels a certain quiet relief at having successfully navigated Mr. Collins's proposal, though a small, private unease lingers about how her decision might affect her friendship with Charlotte, should that particular quarter yield the very different outcome she suspects it might. The garden itself remains peaceful and unhurried, hedgerows neatly trimmed, the last of the season's flowers still blooming modestly along the borders, entirely indifferent to the small domestic dramas unfolding within the house nearby. Elizabeth pauses beside a low stone wall, gathering her thoughts, grateful for this brief moment of solitude after days spent navigating her mother's disappointment and Mr. Collins's wounded formality. We will continue shortly, following the surprising news that soon arrives regarding Charlotte Lucas, and the introduction of a new and rather charming young officer who will soon capture rather more of Elizabeth's genuine interest than Mr. Collins ever managed. Within a very short time indeed, news arrived that confirmed Elizabeth's private suspicions entirely. Charlotte Lucas, ever practical and considerably less romantic in her expectations than her friend, had accepted Mr. Collins's renewed proposal, reasoning calmly that at 27, without beauty or fortune to particularly recommend her, marriage to a respectable, if somewhat ridiculous, clergyman represented her best and most sensible chance at a comfortable, settled future. Elizabeth received this news with genuine astonishment, unable at first to reconcile her friend's evident good sense with what seemed to her an almost inconceivable willingness to marry a man so entirely lacking in either wit or genuine feeling. When she visited Charlotte shortly afterward, her friend explained her reasoning with calm, practical clarity, admitting that she was not romantic, and asked only for a comfortable home, adding that, given her prospects, Mr. Collins's character, situation in life, and connections were, all things considered, as fair as most people could boast on entering the marriage state. Elizabeth, though privately unable to fully share her friend's pragmatic view of matrimony, respected Charlotte too much to press the matter further, and gradually reconciled herself to the match, even as she privately resolved that she herself would never settle for a marriage built on such purely practical foundations, however sensible such reasoning might genuinely be for a woman in Charlotte's particular circumstances. It was around this same time that a new regiment of militia arrived to be stationed at Meryton for the winter, bringing with it a considerable number of young officers who quickly became great favorites among the neighborhood's younger ladies, Lydia and Kitty especially, who could speak of little else beyond regimentals and dashing young lieutenants for days on end. Among these newly arrived officers was a Mr. Wickham, whose gentlemanlike appearance, easy manners, and genuine conversational charm made him an instant and considerable favorite wherever he appeared. At a party given by their aunt in Meryton, Elizabeth found herself seated beside Mr. Wickham, and was soon drawn into easy, agreeable conversation with him, delighted to discover a gentleman whose company proved genuinely pleasant rather than merely formally polite. Their conversation eventually turned to Mr. Darcy, whom Wickham, Elizabeth learned with some surprise, had known since childhood, their families having been closely connected for many years through Wickham's late father's long service as steward to Darcy's own father at Pemberley. Wickham spoke of Darcy with a carefully measured reluctance that only heightened Elizabeth's curiosity, hinting at some past injury or disappointment he had suffered at Darcy's hands, though claiming, with apparent modesty, that he would rather not speak ill of the son of a man to whom he owed so much, even as his careful phrasing made abundantly clear exactly how deeply wronged he felt himself to have been. Pressed gently by Elizabeth's evident curiosity, Wickham eventually shared his story more fully, explaining that Darcy's late father had intended to provide handsomely for him, having promised him a valuable church living that would have secured his future comfortably. However, upon the elder Mr. Darcy's death, the current Mr. Darcy had, according to Wickham's account, disregarded his father's wishes entirely, denying him the promised living out of what Wickham characterized as simple jealousy and dislike, born from Wickham's own greater popularity during their shared childhood. Elizabeth listened to this account with growing indignation on Wickham's behalf, finding it entirely consistent with the proud, disagreeable character she had already formed of Mr. Darcy from their earliest, unpromising acquaintance. Wickham's gentle, apparently reluctant manner of relating such a painful history only made his account more affecting and believable in her eyes, and she found her existing dislike of Darcy considerably strengthened by this fresh evidence of what seemed like genuine cruelty toward a man who had, by all appearances, done nothing to deserve such treatment. She resolved, with her usual decisive spirit, to think even less favorably of Mr. Darcy than she already had, entirely unaware that Wickham's carefully constructed account, delivered with such apparent reluctance and modesty, concealed a rather different and considerably less flattering truth about his own character and past conduct. Let us rest here once more, picturing a quiet evening at Longbourn following this eventful gathering. Elizabeth sits by her bedroom window, turning over in her mind everything Wickham had shared with her that evening, feeling a curious mixture of sympathy for his apparent misfortune and renewed conviction regarding Mr. Darcy's proud, ungenerous character. Outside, the November evening has settled into quiet darkness, stars scattered faintly across a clear, cold sky. There is something quietly significant unfolding in this moment, though Elizabeth herself remains entirely unaware of it, a story accepted perhaps too readily, an impression formed perhaps too quickly, based on nothing more than one charming gentleman's carefully persuasive account and her own existing prejudice against a man she has already decided, with characteristic firmness, to dislike. We will continue shortly, following the preparations now underway for a grand ball at Netherfield, an event that promises to bring Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy into rather closer contact once again, this time under circumstances neither of them fully anticipates. Bringing together everything explored across this section of our story, a fuller and increasingly complicated picture has begun to take shape. Mr. Collins's rejected proposal has led, rather unexpectedly, to his engagement with Charlotte Lucas instead, a match built on practical reasoning rather than romantic feeling, quietly reshaping Elizabeth's understanding of what marriage might reasonably mean for a woman in her friend's particular circumstances. Meanwhile, the arrival of the militia has introduced Mr. Wickham, whose charming manner and affecting story of past injury at Mr. Darcy's hands has only deepened Elizabeth's existing prejudice against a man she has, from their very first meeting, found proud and disagreeable. Beneath all of this, unacknowledged and unexplored, Mr. Darcy's own feelings toward Elizabeth continue quietly developing, entirely at odds with the harsh judgment she has now doubly confirmed against him, first through his own early rudeness, and now through Wickham's carefully persuasive account of old grievances. There remains still more of this gentle story left to explore, the grand ball at Netherfield drawing steadily closer, and with it, the growing likelihood that Pride and Prejudice alike will soon be tested rather more directly than either Elizabeth or Mr. Darcy has yet anticipated. The long-anticipated ball at Netherfield finally arrived, and Elizabeth attended with rather mixed feelings, curious to see whether Mr. Wickham, whom she had come to admire considerably, would be present among the invited officers. To her genuine disappointment, he was absent entirely, having, she later learned, deliberately avoided the gathering specifically to escape any awkward encounter with Mr. Darcy, a fact that only deepened her sympathy for his supposed past mistreatment and her corresponding disapproval of Darcy himself. Her evening took an unexpected turn when Mr. Darcy, rather to her surprise, requested her hand for a dance, and though her first instinct was refusal, she found herself, almost before she realized it, accepting. Their dance together passed largely in silence at first, until Elizabeth, unable to resist the temptation, began teasing him gently about his reserved manner, eventually steering the conversation, with deliberate provocation, toward the subject of Mr. Wickham, watching carefully for whatever reaction this might provoke. Darcy's countenance changed visibly at the mention of that name, though he offered only that Wickham had the happy manner of making friends easily, though whether he was equally capable of retaining them was less certain. Elizabeth, hearing in this careful phrasing further confirmation of Darcy's supposed unfair treatment of his old friend, felt her dislike of him solidify even further, entirely unaware of how completely mistaken her understanding of the true situation actually was. The evening grew considerably more uncomfortable still when Mr. Collins, ever oblivious to social nuance, insisted on introducing himself to Mr. Darcy directly, launching into an elaborate and entirely unsolicited speech about his connection to Darcy's own aunt, the formidable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, whose patronage he clearly considered among his life's greatest honors. Darcy received this unwelcome introduction with barely concealed astonishment, offering only the briefest, coolest replies before extracting himself as quickly as propriety allowed, while Elizabeth watched the whole excruciating exchange with a mixture of mortification and reluctant amusement at her cousin's persistent lack of social awareness. Adding further to her discomfort that evening, Elizabeth overheard, quite by accident, a conversation between Mr. Darcy and Miss Bingley in which Darcy's sister spoke rather pointedly and unkindly about the Bennet family's lack of proper connections and fortune, comments that, though not directed at her personally, stung considerably given how deeply her own family's behavior throughout the evening. Her mother's loud, indiscreet remarks about Jane's supposed engagement, chief among them, seemed to be inviting precisely this kind of unflattering judgment from Netherfield's more fashionable guests. Elizabeth left the ball that evening with her spirits considerably lower than they had been upon arrival, troubled equally by her family's public missteps and her own complicated, unresolved feelings regarding the peculiar mixture of civility and coldness Mr. Darcy continued to display toward her. Not long after the ball, unwelcome news reached Longbourn that the entire Netherfield party had departed rather abruptly for London, with no clear indication of when, or indeed whether, they intended to return. A letter soon followed from Miss Bingley to Jane, written in terms that, upon careful reading, suggested rather strongly that her brother's affections had shifted, or would soon be encouraged to shift, toward a Miss Darcy, whom the letter praised extensively as an ideal future connection for the Bingley family. Jane bore this painful disappointment with her usual quiet composure, though Elizabeth, watching her beloved sister's carefully controlled grief, felt a fierce, protective anger toward everyone she believed responsible for this cruel turn of events, Miss Bingley's calculated interference chief among her suspicions, though she could not help wondering, too, whether Mr. Darcy himself had played some part in persuading his friend away from an attachment he had likely considered beneath his own family's elevated social standing. Elizabeth did her best to comfort her sister through the difficult weeks that followed, gently encouraging her to trust in Bingley's genuine affection while privately harboring growing doubts about whether such affection, however real, would prove strong enough to withstand whatever pressure his sisters and Darcy might continue to exert against a match they clearly considered unsuitable. As winter gave way gradually to spring, Elizabeth accepted an invitation to visit Charlotte, now comfortably settled as Mrs. Collins in the parsonage at Hunsford, situated conveniently near Rosings Park, the grand estate belonging to none other than Lady Catherine de Bourgh herself, the very patroness whose praises Mr. Collins had sung so tirelessly since his very first arrival at Longbourn. Charlotte appeared genuinely content in her new domestic arrangements, having settled into a practical, comfortable routine that suited her temperament well, managing her household affairs with quiet competence while allowing her husband his continued devotion to Lady Catherine's every wish and opinion. Elizabeth found herself unexpectedly charmed by the peaceful rhythm of country parsonage life, even as she continued to find Mr. Collins's formal manner and constant deference toward his patroness a source of considerable private amusement. It was during this visit that Elizabeth finally had occasion to meet Lady Catherine herself, a tall, imposing woman whose manner combined haughty self-importance with an evident habit of expecting her opinions to be received as unquestionable fact by everyone around her. Lady Catherine questioned Elizabeth directly and rather bluntly about her family, her education, and her prospects, displaying throughout their conversation the same commanding, presumptuous confidence that clearly ran through her entire family line. Let us pause here for a moment, and rest quietly in the gentle stillness of the Hunsford parsonage garden. Picture Elizabeth walking slowly along a favorite path, spring flowers just beginning to bloom along the borders, the grand outline of Rosings Park visible in the distance through a gap in the trees. There is something peaceful in this particular stretch of her visit, despite Lady Catherine's overbearing presence nearby, a quiet interlude of country walks and comfortable conversation with her old friend Charlotte. Elizabeth pauses beside a low garden gate, watching birds settle among the budding branches overhead, entirely unaware that her quiet visit is about to be considerably disrupted by an unexpected arrival, Mr. Darcy himself, come to visit his aunt at Rosings, along with his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, bringing with him all the complicated, unresolved feelings that have continued quietly developing since their last difficult parting at the Netherfield ball. We will continue shortly, following what happens as Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy find themselves once again thrown together, this time in circumstances that will finally force both of them to confront feelings neither has yet been willing to properly acknowledge. During his stay at Rosings, Mr. Darcy called upon the parsonage with unusual frequency, often arriving alone, and Elizabeth found their conversations, once again, falling into that familiar pattern of sharp, spirited exchange that had characterized their earlier acquaintance at Netherfield. One afternoon, while Elizabeth sat alone in the parsonage, Darcy arrived unexpectedly, and after some initial awkward, halting conversation, he suddenly declared, with evident emotion, that he had struggled against his feelings in vain, and must confess that he ardently admired and loved her. Elizabeth, utterly astonished by this unexpected declaration, listened with growing indignation as he continued, acknowledging, even in the midst of his proposal, the many objections he had overcome in offering his hand, her family's inferior connections and lack of fortune chief among them, phrasing his admiration in terms so laced with condescension that Elizabeth's initial shock quickly hardened into genuine anger. She refused him decidedly, and when he demanded to know the reason for such an ungracious rejection, she cited, first, his role in separating Bingley from her sister Jane, and second, his shameful treatment of Mr. Wickham, whose fortune and happiness he had, according to what she believed, cruelly and unjustly destroyed. Darcy, visibly shaken by these accusations, defended himself only briefly before departing the parsonage abruptly, leaving Elizabeth alone, trembling with the combined force of her anger and the sheer unexpectedness of everything that had just occurred between them. The following morning, while walking alone in the grounds near the parsonage, Elizabeth encountered Mr. Darcy once more, who pressed into her hand a lengthy letter before departing without another word. Retreating to a quiet, secluded spot to read it properly, Elizabeth discovered that the letter addressed, point by point, the very accusations she had leveled against him the previous evening, beginning with the matter of Bingley and Jane. Darcy explained that he had indeed encouraged his friend's departure from Netherfield, believing genuinely, based on what he had observed, that Jane's feelings, however real, were not deeply enough engaged to cause her lasting pain, and that his own family's objections regarding the Bennets' inferior connections had played a role in his advice, a motive he did not attempt to disguise or excuse, though he expressed genuine regret for any pain his interference might have caused. Far more startling, however, was his account regarding Wickham, which painted an entirely different picture than the one Elizabeth had so readily believed. Darcy explained that Wickham had, in fact, squandered the inheritance his own father had left him, then attempted to seduce Darcy's young sister, Georgiana, into a secret elopement, motivated entirely by her considerable fortune rather than any genuine affection, a scheme Darcy had discovered and prevented only just in time. As for the promised church living, Wickham had accepted a substantial monetary settlement in its place, then squandered that too, before demanding the living regardless, and turning bitterly against Darcy when refused. Elizabeth read this letter with mounting horror and confusion, her initial instinct to dismiss it entirely as self-serving fabrication gradually giving way, upon careful and repeated rereading, to a dawning, uncomfortable recognition that every detail rang uncomfortably true, far more consistent with everything she actually knew of both men's characters than the account she had so eagerly and uncritically accepted from Wickham himself. She recalled, with fresh and painful clarity, small details that had seemed unremarkable at the time but now took on considerable new significance: Wickham's suspiciously convenient absence from the Netherfield ball, the ease and confidence with which he had shared such a damaging story with a woman he had known only briefly, and her own eager willingness to believe the worst of Darcy simply because his manner had first struck her as proud and unwelcoming. How despicably I have acted, she reflected, with genuine and painful self-recrimination. I, who have prided myself on my discernment, have been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd. This moment of honest, uncomfortable self-examination marked a genuine turning point in her understanding, not only of Mr. Darcy's true character, but of her own considerable tendency toward hasty, poorly examined judgment, a flaw she now recognized in herself with the same clarity she had so readily applied to criticizing others. Let us rest here once more, picturing the quiet parsonage garden where Elizabeth first read Darcy's letter, now settling gently into evening as she walks slowly back toward the house, her mind still turning over everything she has just learned. The spring air carries a soft chill as daylight fades, and Elizabeth pauses once more beside the low garden gate, gathering her composure before returning to Charlotte's cheerful company, unwilling just yet to share the full weight of what has passed between herself and Mr. Darcy. There is something quietly significant in this particular evening, a young woman beginning, slowly and honestly, to reconsider judgments she had once held with such absolute, comfortable certainty, recognizing, with real humility, that pride was never Mr. Darcy's failing alone, but one she herself had carried just as surely, dressed up instead as sharp wit and quick, confident judgment. We will continue shortly, following Elizabeth's return home to Longbourn, and the surprising events, both joyful and troubling, that await her family in the months that follow this quiet, transformative turning point. Bringing together everything explored across this section of our story, a considerably deepened and more complicated picture has now taken shape. Mr. Darcy's unexpected proposal, however clumsily and proudly delivered, revealed feelings far more genuine and long-standing than Elizabeth had ever suspected, while his subsequent letter dismantled, piece by piece, the false impressions she had so readily accepted regarding both his own character and Mr. Wickham's considerably less honorable one. Elizabeth's journey through this section has been one of genuine, uncomfortable growth, moving from confident, hasty judgment toward a far more humble and honest reckoning with her own considerable capacity for prejudice, even as she begins to recognize, with quiet astonishment, that the proud, disagreeable man she once dismissed so thoroughly possesses a depth of genuine feeling and personal integrity she had never allowed herself to properly see. There remains still more of this gentle story left to explore: Elizabeth's return home, the family difficulties still awaiting her there, and the slow, careful process by which Pride and Prejudice alike must eventually give way to something considerably warmer and more honest between two people who have, each in their own way, been forced to see both themselves and each other rather more clearly than before. In the months that followed, life brought a great deal more before Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy's story reached its gentle conclusion. Lydia, the youngest and most heedless of the Bennet sisters, ran off with none other than Mr. Wickham himself, an elopement that threatened, for a time, to bring disgrace upon the entire family, until Mr. Darcy, quietly and without seeking any credit for it, tracked the pair down in London and arranged, at his own considerable expense, for their proper marriage, sparing the Bennets from ruin entirely out of his own growing, unacknowledged love for Elizabeth. When Elizabeth eventually learned the truth of what Darcy had done, quietly, discreetly, asking nothing in return, her opinion of him, already much softened since his letter at Hunsford, warmed considerably further still. Not long afterward, Mr. Bingley returned to Netherfield, his affection for Jane entirely unchanged, and this time, with Darcy's own quiet blessing rather than his earlier interference, the two were swiftly and happily engaged. Darcy himself soon returned as well, and in time, walking together one quiet afternoon, he renewed his proposal to Elizabeth, this time with none of his earlier pride, but with a warmth and humility that reflected everything both of them had learned since their difficult first meeting. Elizabeth, her own prejudice long since given way to genuine understanding and affection, accepted him gladly, and the two were married not long after, alongside Jane and Bingley, in a double celebration that brought the whole Bennet family, at long last, genuine and lasting happiness. Elizabeth and Darcy settled at Pemberley, his grand estate in Derbyshire, where Elizabeth's wit and warmth soon won over even the formidable Georgiana, and where visits from Jane and Bingley, now settled nearby, kept the two sisters close for the rest of their lives. Pride, it turned out, had needed humbling, and prejudice had needed correcting, but beneath both, all along, had been two people whose honesty and growing understanding of themselves, and of each other, proved more than equal to overcoming whatever misunderstanding had first kept them apart. Thank you so much for spending this quiet time with Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy's story tonight. If you enjoyed this gentle telling of Pride and Prejudice, consider liking this video, subscribing for more calming classics like it, and letting me know in the comments which story you would like to hear next. Sleep well, and good night.